In a world blurred by noise and haste, there remained a whisper, a voice not of this earth. It wasn't heard with the ears, but with the soul. It spoke not to the crowds, but to the silent hearts that dared to seek. This voice echoed through centuries, untouched by time, and yet pulsing with urgency today. "Call to me," it said, not as a suggestion, but as a lifeline. Beneath city lights and behind weary eyes, that call waited, buried under doubt and distraction. People passed. By miracles every day, blind to wonder, deaf to the divine. But the voice remained, always near, always ready. And to those who paused, who whispered back even a single word, the heavens opened. It was the beginning of something unseen, a spark that ignited the unseen realm. The divine invitation wasn't to religion, it was to revelation, not to tradition, but to transformation. The words were ancient yet alive. "Call to me and I will answer." Few believed it, fewer still tested it, but for those who did, nothing was ever the same again. There was a boy once, no more than 15, who walked among ruins. War had torn his city into stone and ash, but his spirit, though shaken, was not shattered. He had heard of the God who speaks, not from priests or papers, but from his grandmother's stories. She used to whisper promises by candlelight. One night, as the smoke from a bombed building curled like a serpent into the sky, the boy dropped to his knees. No one watched, no one cared, but heaven leaned in. "God," he whispered, "if you're there, speak." Silence followed, long and heavy. Then the wind shifted, not outside, but inside. A warmth filled his chest. A thought not his own entered his mind. "You are not forgotten." He wept, not because he was sad, but because he had been heard. Something changed. He rose not with answers, but with peace. That was the first lesson. God doesn't always explain. He assures. And assurance is sometimes a greater miracle than explanation. In a faraway village wrapped in mountain fog, a woman stirred her pot of lentils as thunder rolled above. Her life had been marked by waiting. Waiting for healing. Waiting for love. Waiting for a child. Years passed like wind through branches, seen only by what they moved. She had almost given up. Almost. Until a neighbor, older and half-blind, handed her a note. One verse scribbled on wrinkled paper, Jeremiah 33:3. She read it again and again. "Call to me." The next morning, before dawn kissed the hills, she walked into the woods. There, alone among the trees, she cried out. Not a polite prayer, but a desperate one. Her words spilled like rain, angry, raw, aching. And in the quiet that followed, something stirred. The birds didn't sing, the wind didn't blow. Yet she felt watched, seen, held. That year, a miracle bloomed. Not in her womb, but in her heart. Joy came, not through what she received, but through who she met in the silence. An old professor in a city university was known for his skepticism. He taught philosophy, dissected scripture, and dismissed faith as myth. But late at night, when the halls were empty and his soul unsettled, he wondered if he was wrong. One evening, while reading ancient texts alone in his office, he paused. On a passage he'd once mocked, "Call to me and I will answer you." It unsettled him, not because he believed, but because it felt alive. He shut the book and whispered to the ceiling, half in jest, half in fear, "All right then, if you exist, show me." That night, he dreamed of fire, not destruction, but light, endless light. A voice, not audible but undeniable, said, "You've spent your life searching in the dark." He awoke trembling. He didn't change overnight. But the mocking stopped. The questions deepened. The prayers began, not as studies, but as conversations. And over time, the scholar became a seeker. The voice had answered, not with facts, but with presence. On the other side of the world, a child wandered through a refugee camp with eyes too old for her age. Her family was gone, her past erased. But she clung to a tattered book she couldn't read, one her father once held close. It was a Bible, worn and dirty, pages torn by time and war. She didn't understand the words, but she slept with it pressed to her chest. One night she dreamed of a garden, and in the garden stood a man with scars on his hands. He smiled and said only this, "I hear you." The next morning a volunteer visited the camp, handing out food and speaking softly. As he left, he gave her a new copy of the book, open to Jeremiah 33. She couldn't read it, but when she touched the page, she felt warmth, as if the paper remembered the voice from her dream. That was enough. She had been answered, not in language, but in love. A man with everything, a mansion, a company, a name, sat in his luxury car, numb. The world called him successful. His soul called him hollow. He had tried everything, therapy, travel, even religion. Nothing quieted the noise, until one night, parked beneath a sky littered with stars, he turned off the music, the engine, the lights. In the silence, he whispered what he hadn't told anyone. "I'm lost." Not geographically, spiritually. And that whisper, though small, was the loudest thing heaven heard that night. He didn't see visions. He didn't feel fire. But something inside cracked, like dry ground under the first drop of rain. He went home, found a Bible he hadn't touched in years, and opened it at random. Jeremiah 33:3 stared back. Tears came, not from sadness, but from recognition. It was as if the verse had been waiting for him all along. And maybe it had. There was a prisoner once. Tattoos on his arms, guilt on his shoulders. He hadn't seen the sky in years. Rage had been his refuge, regret his companion. One night, unable to sleep, he remembered a phrase his mother used to say, "God listens even in the dark." He laughed bitterly, but then he called, not aloud, but within. He thought of the things he'd done, the people he'd hurt. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't think he deserved it, but he asked to be heard. That night he dreamed of a river, clear, deep, endless, and a voice saying, "You are more than your past." When he awoke, the cell felt different, not brighter, not wider, just less empty. He began to write letters to the people he had wronged. He didn't ask for anything. He just confessed. In every letter he wrote, "Call to him. He listens." He had been answered. Now he was answering back. In a hospital bed, an old woman clutched her chest with tubes in her veins and monitors beeping. Around her, the doctors had stopped promising miracles. Her children had said their goodbyes, but her eyes still searched the ceiling, waiting. One night, when the hallway lights dimmed and the nurses moved like shadows, she whispered, I'm ready, Lord. But I'm afraid. And in that moment, the room felt warmer. Not physically, but spiritually. The fear didn't vanish, but something stronger rose within it. Peace. In her mind, she saw a staircase of light, and at the top, a hand extended toward her. It didn't pull. It waited. She smiled. That was the last thing the nurse saw before the machine flatlined. But in another realm, the voice that had once said, "Call to me now," whispered, "Welcome home." Somewhere in the chaos of modern life, a young artist painted on walls no one noticed. Her colors were bold, her soul broken. She used art to scream what she couldn't say. One afternoon, sitting on a rooftop, she looked over the city and asked aloud, "Is anyone out there who sees me?" She didn't expect an answer. But later that night, she walked past a mural she hadn't painted. It was new, fresh, and on it, in thick black strokes, were the words, Jeremiah 33:3. She froze. Something in her chest fluttered. She searched online, found the verse, and read it again and again. It felt like a reply, like someone had been waiting for her question. She went home and painted, not with anger, but with hope. A whisper had become a reply. A question. A conversation. In the deep silence of the desert, a traveler pitched his tent and stared at the stars. He had come for solitude, but found longing. He had heard of people who claimed to hear God, and he envied them. That night, surrounded by endless sand and silence, he simply said, "I want to know you." No wind answered, no stars moved. But in his dreams, he walked through a valley of bones, and they rose, clothed in flesh, alive. A voice echoed through the canyon, "Things you do not know." He awoke with tears in his eyes and a hunger in his heart. He returned to the city not with stories, but with a new lens. He looked at strangers and saw souls. He read the old scriptures and found fire. The desert hadn't spoken. God had. In the midst of a bustling subway station, a janitor moved unnoticed among the tide of commuters. Each night, long after the crowds disappeared, he would sweep the platforms and hum forgotten hymns. No one knew he had once been a preacher. One who had lost his pulpit, his family, and nearly his faith. But he had never stopped believing in the verse that had once saved him. "Call to me, and I will answer." He had called again and again, though no miracle came. Still, he waited. Then one night, while mopping a dim corridor, he found a teenager curled in a corner, crying silently. Without thinking, he sat beside her and said, "God hears, even when we don't." She looked at him, eyes wide with pain. He offered her no lecture, only the verse. She whispered, "I needed that." And in that moment, the janitor realized something. The answer had come. Not for him alone, but through him. For someone else. A woman sat in a crowded church on Christmas Eve, dressed in black while the world wore red and gold. It had been a year of loss. Her father, her job, her strength. She didn't come for joy. She came because she had nowhere else to go. The choir sang, children laughed, candles flickered, but her heart remained hollow. When the pastor read Jeremiah 33:3, she barely listened, until he added, "Even the quietest call is heard by the loudest love." That night in bed, she tried to pray. Nothing came, so she simply whispered, "Please." That was all. And it was enough. Dreams didn't follow. Visions didn't blaze. But when she woke, something small had shifted. She got dressed. She made coffee. She smiled at her neighbor. Life hadn't changed, but she had. The whisper had been answered, not with a miracle, but with the strength to keep going. In a jungle hut where missionaries once taught, a young man found a tattered Bible beneath the floorboards. He had grown up hearing tales of a God who speaks, but now those tales felt like fiction. His world was full of survival, not spirituality. But something drew him to the book. That night, beneath a sky painted with stars and cicadas singing, like angels in disguise, he read Jeremiah 33:3. The words struck him like thunder in still air. He put the book down and said, "If this is real, then prove it." Minutes passed, then hours, and then a knock at his door. A traveler had gotten lost in the jungle and needed shelter. The stranger smiled and said, "I was praying someone would help me." The young man blinked. Something had answered both prayers at once. Two voices, one response. That was the first of many signs. He kept the verse pinned above his door ever since. A veteran sat in a quiet field where poppies bloomed among the grass. He had survived war, but not the peace that followed. Nightmares chased him, guilt chained him. He didn't believe in redemption, only endurance. Yet on the anniversary of a battle that took his friends, he walked alone into that field and collapsed to his knees. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But in the silence his heart cried out, and there, beneath the open sky, he heard nothing. But he felt something. A warmth. A presence. A stillness that soothed like a balm on a bleeding soul. Later he found a Bible in a box of old belongings. He flipped it open and found a note inside, written by his mother. "Read Jeremiah 33:3 when you feel lost." He wept, because he had never told her how lost he really was. But somehow she'd known. And God had known. And now he was not alone. In a modern skyscraper, a young executive faced a choice that could change his future or destroy it. He had found corruption in his company. Speaking up would cost him everything. Staying silent would cost him his soul. In a hotel room high above the city, he opened a Gideon Bible out of habit more than hope. His eyes landed on a highlighted verse, "Call to me, and I will answer you." He laughed, bitter and tired. "What's the point?" he muttered. But then he spoke, slowly. "If you see me, help me do the right thing." He felt no lightning, no wind, but he did feel courage. The next day he told the truth. He lost the job, but kept his peace. Weeks later, another company hired him, impressed by his integrity. And in the welcome package they sent, a card. No name, no signature. Just one verse, Jeremiah 33:3. He knew then, heaven answers in ways the world cannot predict. A child in a silent house sat under a blanket fort, flashlight in hand, afraid of monsters. Her parents fought downstairs, their anger echoing through the walls. She didn't understand the words, only the fear. She held her stuffed lion and whispered to it, "Can God hear in here?" Somewhere she remembered a Sunday school verse. Barely understood. "Call to me." So she did. "Please help me not be scared." The night grew quieter. Her breathing slowed, and in her dream she saw a lion standing beside her, glowing with gentle light. The next morning she found a note on her pillow. Her older brother had left it before running away. It read, "God hears. Stay brave." Jeremiah 33:3. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew she wasn't alone anymore. That lion still guarded her dreams, and someday she'd find her brother. She believed it, because she had called and been heard. A mechanic knelt beside a broken-down truck in the middle of a desert highway. He had driven into the sands hoping to outrun his grief. His wife was gone, his faith buried with her. He kicked the tire, cursed the sky, and shouted, "If you're so real, then fix something!" The silence mocked him. But then, in the distance, a single pair of headlights appeared. A stranger pulled over, handed him water, and helped restart the engine. Before leaving, the stranger handed him a small card. "Found this years ago. Think it's for you now." The mechanic unfolded it. Faded ink. Only one line. Jeremiah 3:3. He didn't cry. Not yet. But that night back home, he opened a Bible they used to read together. He found the verse. He whispered, "Thank you," to a ski he wasn't sure heard him. But he felt her smile in the quiet. And maybe that was answer enough. A teacher in a worn-out school had lost hope in her students and herself. The world seemed too broken. Her work too small. One afternoon, while cleaning her desk, she found a card made by a former student. It read, "You once told me to call on God. I did. He answered. Thank you." Inside the card was a drawing of Jeremiah 33:3. She hadn't remembered saying it, but apparently she had. That night she sat at her desk and whispered, "I forgot you were listening." Tears came, not from sadness, but from rediscovery. The next day she taught like it mattered, because it did. Seeds grow in silence, and she had planted many. Some never say thank you, some never return, but one did. And that was enough to remind her, even tired voices are heard. In a stormy forest, a hiker lost the trail. His compass broke, his phone died. Panic clawed at his throat. Night fell fast, and with it came fear. Alone in the dark, he whispered, "I don't want to die here." And then louder, "If anyone hears me, please." He stumbled forward and tripped over a fallen tree. Beneath it, he saw something strange. A rusted sign buried in leaves. It pointed left, toward an old ranger station. Hours later, safe and warm, he told the rescuers about the sign. They looked confused. "There's no sign on that trail," he insisted. They shrugged, but one of them said, "You're lucky. You must have had someone looking out for you." He smiled. Not luck. A reply. The call had been heard and answered. In a prison cell, a man sat staring at the ceiling, the weight of his past pressing down like chains on his chest. Years had passed since his sentence began, and the walls knew all his regrets. He had pushed away every visitor, rejected every chapel invitation. But one night, unable to sleep, he found a torn page tucked into his mattress. It read, "Call to me, and I will answer you." He scoffed. What could you say to someone like me? But the verse wouldn't leave him. Days later, he whispered it into the silence. Nothing changed, but something cracked inside. He started attending the chapel, not for freedom, he'd never leave these walls, but for peace. Years later, a new inmate wept beside him and asked, "Is there any hope?" He handed him the page. "This saved me. Maybe it's for you now." Hope, like grace, had echoed through those walls again. In a war-torn village, a nurse tended to the wounded by candlelight. Bombs had shattered homes, but not her spirit. Still, doubt crept in during the quiet moments. "What's the point?" she thought, wrapping another bandage. Then one boy with burns on his arms looked at her and said, "I prayed for someone to come." She paused. "You did?" He nodded. "And then you came, just like the verse says." She asked what verse. He pointed to the wall, where someone had scribbled Jeremiah 33:3. She sat down, heart pounding. That night she read the verse by candlelight, and for the first time in weeks, she felt seen. Her work was not in vain. She was someone's answer, and that was enough to keep going, candle by candle, wound by wound, prayer by prayer. A scientist in a sleek laboratory stared at a blackboard filled with equations that led nowhere. He believed in logic, evidence, reason, never miracles. But lately, something in him longed for more, for meaning beyond matter. One night, while reviewing data, he found a note slipped inside an old physics book, left by a previous professor. It read, "Even the mind needs mystery, Jeremiah 33:3. Intrigued, he looked it up. The verse stirred something ancient inside him. He muttered, "If you're real, speak in a language I'll understand." Days passed. Then suddenly, a breakthrough, one that resolved a theory he'd pursued for years. It wasn't proof of God, but it felt guided. He wrote a note in his own journal. Not all truths are measurable. Some must be received. Science had given him answers. But this verse reminded him, some answers first require a call. In a rehab center, a woman sat in a circle of strangers, holding a cup of cold coffee and her own shame. Her past was a graveyard of mistakes, her future a fog. When asked to share, she shook her head. What could she say? But that night, in her room, she stared at the ceiling and whispered, "If anyone's still listening, I'm here." The next morning, a new counselor joined the group. She introduced herself, then read a verse. "Call to me and I will answer you." The woman froze. The words felt like an echo. After the session, she approached the counselor. "Why that verse?" The counselor smiled. "It saved me once. Maybe it'll help someone else today." That was the beginning of her healing. She wasn't just another name on a clipboard. She was heard, and because of that, she began to listen too. At the edge of a lighthouse, an old keeper polished the glass as waves crashed below. He had manned the light for decades, guiding ships he would never meet. No one remembered his name anymore, but each night he lit the flame. One evening, a letter arrived, addressed only to the lighthouse. Inside, a sailor wrote, "During a storm, I saw your light. I prayed someone would be out there. Your light was God's answer." Tucked inside was a verse, Jeremiah 33:3. The old man stared at it for a long time. Then, with trembling hands, he added the letter to a wooden box labeled Reasons. He had dozens now, each a reminder that even a silent flame can be the voice someone needs. He would keep lighting it, not for thanks, not for glory, but because someone, somewhere, would call, and someone, somewhere, must answer. In a quiet bookstore, a woman sorted used books for the shelf. One title slipped from her hands and fell open on the floor. A folded letter was tucked inside. Curious, she opened it. It read, "To whoever finds this, know that your life still matters. God hears you." Jeremiah 33:3. She laughed, nervously, looking around. Was this a joke? But later that night, after another argument at home and tears in the bathroom, she remembered the letter. She read it again, slower, and this time it felt personal. The next day, she put a copy of the verse on the back wall of the bookstore. Customers began noticing. Some smiled, some wept. One even asked if she was the one who wrote it. She wasn't, but now she understood. Someone had once called. God had answered, and that answer kept echoing, one reader at a time. A farmer in a drought-stricken land stared at the cracked soil beneath his boots. The rain hadn't come for months, and neither had hope. He knelt beside a dying crop and prayed, not for a harvest, but for peace. That night, he dreamed of his father, long gone, standing in the field, smiling. "Call to him," the dream said, "and you'll understand." The farmer woke with tears on his face. He opened the dusty Bible in the kitchen drawer and read Jeremiah 33:3 aloud. Then he walked outside and planted a single seed, even though the ground was dry. Days later, clouds gathered, rain came. Not a flood, not a miracle, but enough. And that was what the verse had promised. Not magic, but mystery. Not control, but comfort. His field still needed work, but his soul had heard the answer. A college student sat in a crowded library, feeling invisible. Everyone else seemed to have purpose, plans, direction. She had none. She opened her notebook to doodle, but instead wrote, "Why am I here?" She closed her eyes and whispered, "If you made me, tell me why." The next day, her professor assigned a paper on meaning in literature. In the suggested sources was a poem titled "Call to Me." She looked it up. It referenced Jeremiah 33:3. That night she read the verse, and something inside her clicked. She wasn't an accident. She wasn't forgotten. She began writing. Not just essays, but letters to God. Little by little, she found her voice. Her major changed. So did her confidence, not because everything was clear, but because she had been heard. And from that moment on, she listened differently to life. In a nursing home, an old man stared out the window all day, watching birds come and go. His voice had grown quiet. His days, long. Once a storyteller, now he spoke to no one. One day, a nurse asked if he wanted music. He shook his head. Instead, he held up a worn Bible. "Read this," he whispered, pointing to a marked page. She read aloud, "Call to me, and I will answer you." She asked, "Do you believe that?" He smiled faintly. "I'm waiting." That night, she found a recording device and asked him to share his life story. Day by day, he spoke again. Stories of war, of love, of God's faithfulness. Weeks later, a group of students visited. She played the recordings. They listened, amazed. The old man died peacefully a month later. But his voice lived on. He had called and been remembered. In a city cafe, a barista served coffee with a forced smile. Customers came and went, but she felt invisible. Her dream of being an artist was fading. Then one morning, a woman left behind a sketchbook. Inside was a drawing of a hand reaching toward heaven with the caption, Jeremiah 33:3. She flipped through and found a note. Art is a call. Keep drawing. That night, she picked up her pencil again. Days later, she began sketching customers, without them noticing, then giving them portraits with short blessings. Smiles returned. Conversations started. Someone asked to buy her work. Her cafe corner became a gallery of kindness. She never saw the woman who left the sketchbook again, but she didn't need to. The message had arrived. She had called and been called, and now she helped others hear it too.